to this co-main event of the evening. I'm not sure where the co-main event is going to end up, right? I think that this is a card that's in flux. I'm not sure if some fights will be added. There's not as many bouts as you're used to on a typical UFC card. However, I'm thinking to myself, this is an interesting co-main event for what it is. You've got Chepe Mariscal taking on Damon Jackson. And these are two guys who are both, maybe under the radar, low-key veterans, right? You've got a guy in Chepe Mariscal who's a lot younger, 31, going on 32. You got Damon Jackson, whose birthday is this week. He's going to have just turned 36 years of age by the time that this fight kicks off. And you look at Damon Jackson, the guy's had a remarkable career turnaround in the UFC. When you look at his 6-4-1 record in the UFC with 1 no contest, you could draw the conclusion, man, that's not a great record. That's maybe a journeymanish record. But you go back and look, guys, he lost to Yancy Medeiros. He had a no contest with Hani Jason. This is all the way back in 2014, 2015. He went to a draw with Levan Makashvili on UFC on Fox 18 back in 2016. Then he gets cut from the UFC. So he goes back to the regional scene. He gets a bunch of wins together. He goes to PFL. And when he came back to the UFC, guys, he fights Mirsad Bektic and gets this incredible comeback win in the 3rd round, right? Then you see him go out there and get absolutely starched by Ilia Topuria. And we all know what turned out of Ilia Topuria, right? That guy stunk. He never turned into anything. Yeah, how did Damon Jackson lose to that jobber? I'm kidding, of course, right? He's a top champion in the UFC. Somebody who's going to be fighting Max Holloway later this year. I'm excited. But then you look, he bounces back from that fight, beats Charles Rosa via a decision that was honestly a little too close for comfort there against Charles Rosa. He was bloodied up so badly at the end. Charles Rosa's going for submission attempts while Damon Jackson's bleeding like a stuck pig. I couldn't believe what I was watching. Then you look at the Kamwilla Kirk fight. That was a great win. Goes out there and submits a guy who's very good at jiu-jitsu. Nothing you could say, but nice win there from Damon Jackson. The Dan Argueta fight, a guy who's competent at wrestling, a guy who's pretty strong physically. Damon Jackson was able to go out there and horse him around. And I think Dan Argueta, is going to do some competing at the 135-pound class, after Damon Jackson gave him the old tour of the octagon at featherweight. And then you look at the fight with Pat Sabatini. I described it as him just going Super Saiyan, right? Unfortunately, if you guys don't know, Damon Jackson, I believe, lost his brother, and it was right before the fight. Very emotional fighter, very emotional fight style. Came out there to try and kill Pat Sabatini, front kicked him in the face. Pat was on wobbly legs, and that was the end of the discussion, really. So you looked at what Damon Jackson has done. He's done a great job since he came back to the UFC. Did he get absolutely starched by Dan Ige? Yes, but Dan Ige, 50K Ige, he's got big power in those hands. He lost to Billy Quarantillo in a competitive fight. I thought that was the fight that I was a little concerned by for Damon long-term. Thought he looked a little slow there. Billy's a guy that can rack up some volume, but I didn't think that was Billy's best performance in the UFC to date. And, Billy was able to go out there and get the win. And you see what happened to Billy his next fight. He got absolutely cleaned up, in pretty short order by Yusuf Zalal. And so I do think that we have to, kind of contextualize that fight a little bit and say, what version of Billy Q was Damon Jackson fighting in that fight? And it still didn't go his way. That's a little bit concerning. But then you look at the Alexander Hernandez fight. He was a co-main event, similar to this spot here. And he was a plus 160 underdog. He ends up coming through and getting the win over Alexander Hernandez. It was a split decision. And honestly, again, that's not a great look for me, right? Alexander Hernandez has a lot of physical gifts and intangibles, but when he cuts down to 145, I think he's a little bit afraid to burn out his gas tank. So I think he's a little bit hesitant on the volume. And then we just saw, even still, he got broken down over time. His cardio did not hold up very well in that fight. And Damon Jackson was able to go out there and earn the win. But this is a guy that was coming off of, 3 losses in his last 4 fights prior to the Damon Jackson fight. So you look at Chepe, he's a guy with a lot more momentum, I feel, coming into this contest. Chepe Mariscal currently in the midst of a 6-fight win streak. He beat Morgan Charrier, split decision. I honestly thought Morgan Charrier should have won that fight. I thought it was a very close fight. I thought 2 of the rounds should have went to Morgan Charrier, but it's a very close fight. So it's not like you could cry him a river, but I would have given it the other way if I was a judge. He was able to defeat Jack Jenkins. I think he whizzered down on a throw attempt from Jack Jenkins and ended up breaking his arm. I don't know exactly what to make of that, but I will just say, like, judo guys, they have that ability to put a lot of pressure on joints, especially the arm. We know how good they are with arm locks, a little bit unconventional as well. And Chepe Mariscal, he's got good throws. We've seen him work that in his own fight. So I guess you don't want to take it away from him, right? It's a fight. You're trying to hurt somebody, but a little bit of a weird outcome in that one. And I believe he had lost round 1 to Jack Jenkins on all 3 judges' scorecards. But I think that when I was watching it live, I thought it was a very competitive round 1. In any case, he beat Trevor Peek, and that was a fight where he showed off some of those throws. He gave Trevor Peek the proverbial tour of the octagon. Honestly, just made him look amateurish in some of the positions and landed a lot of clean shots in that fight. Wasn't able to put him down. He was on a 3-fight win streak prior to that, winning in Cage Warriors, winning in Combate Global, winning in LFA. So he had done a good job, but the fact that he had lost to Sean Soriano in the CFFC is quite concerning, given Sean Soriano's general lack of grappling acumen. The fact that he got knocked out by Steve Garcia is fair play. Steve Garcia has been doing big things in the UFC. He got absolutely sent to the shadow realm by Joe Anderson Brito. That was a borderline crime against humanity. He beat Yusuf Zalal back in the LFA. So again, this guy can go out there and get quality wins. He beat Pat Sabatini via very close split decision. He lost to Bryce Mitchell on the regional scene. He's fought tough guys, man, all throughout his career. And right now, he's a tough guy with a lot of momentum. He's 3-0 in the UFC, but he's taken on the much more seasoned UFC fighter, 6-4-1, like I mentioned, Damon Jackson. So I get making a case for both guys here. I think that Damon Jackson, one of the issues he could present for Chepe is just that he's huge. A lot of these guys Chepe's been fighting are a little bit small, a little bit undersized. And meanwhile, Damon Jackson is going to have a 4-inch height advantage here, standing 5'11". He's going to have a 2-inch reach advantage at 71 inches compared to just 69 for Chepe Mariscal. And he's also, a few years older here, but he's a guy that has, been seemingly trying to put forward his best foot in every fight in the UFC. When he fights guys that are, athletically overmatching him, he gets brought back down to earth a little bit. But when he fights guys that are grinders, that are, talented, skilled fighters, he tends to find a way to leech onto them, right? Like the nickname, and overwhelm them a little bit over time. So I think the line is probably a little bit off here. You see Chepe Mariscal go from being an underdog in every single UFC fight. The guy hasn't been favored to win a fight since the regional scene, to being a pretty substantial favorite in a UFC co-main event against an arguable step up in competition. I think that is a little bit of a red flag, right? Just a warning spot where things could potentially go a little bit sideways for you. Damon Jackson, I still have to calculate it. He doesn't have the strongest trend as an underdog I've ever seen. But again, he has been an underdog all throughout his career. And a guy like Chepe Mariscal is just not used to being the favorite. So we'll see how this fight turns out for him. I have no action on this fight. I don't think that I could get to the Damon Jackson side based on how slow I thought he looked in his last 2 fights, but I will revisit the tape here. Memory can be a tricky thing. So you want to make sure that you go back, if you can, and watch some of the footage and say to yourself, hey, does my memory match up with what I'm seeing visually? And oftentimes there'll be slight deviations, or you'll say, oh man, I forgot this moment. I forgot he hurt him here. I forgot about this big shot that landed. So shout out to Rick Sanchez in the chat, says, I love Chepe. He should not be minus 220. Over 1.5 rounds is the pick to click for you. Dixon says, could that performance be labeled as a outlier or no? The performance for Sabatini. I suppose it's certainly an outlier to front kick him in the face and finish early. But I think that when you look at, how Sabatini's been finished in some of these other fights, I'm not sure it's really fluky as much as Damon understood the assignment and went to work violently in that fight, as opposed to trying to be super technical with his jiu-jitsu. He just ripped him over. Once Pat shot a bad takedown because he was already ripped him over to his back and just started bludgeoning him. It was a very smart performance, I thought, from Damon Jackson. And Damon's one of these guys that his performances can be a little hit and miss, because like I said, he's got some big downsides as a guy who's not super athletic, but you just know that he's going to bring, whatever he's got, and he's going to try and kill the guy, whether he could choke him, whether he could take him to the ground. He's going to try and find a way to win, and it doesn't always go his way, but he's a fun fighter and a guy with a lot of experience. He's a savvy guy, so not a guy I'm always anxious to fade. And he proved it again in that last fight where a lot of people were anxious to fade him. And then, he cost some money. So Shout out to Damon Jackson. He's a Leech after all. Chepe Mariscal is a guy that I haven't predicted all of his fights super well in the UFC either. So I don't feel compelled to get involved now when he's a big favorite, anything like that. Probably a pass fight for me, but fun one. I'm excited to watch that one play out.